are joining us for the second instalment of our fantastic new mini-series, Thriving in the New Economy. And this mini-series, this themed week of content, was devised by my guest who is joining me all this week, and that is Graham Rowan, the chairman of the Elite Investor Club. And Graham, we've always really valued your input. You do look at things in a very different way to the vast majority of people, and I think it's so important to look at what's happening through a very, very objective lens, because with the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown and all the ensuing fallout, we really are in uncharted waters. Nobody knows what's going to happen. It's very uncertain, and that does make it difficult to make decisions, doesn't it?
Well, I think so, yes. I mean, I think there'll be a long debate about the medical response to this. I think, there's quite a consensus now building that we could and should have done more in January and February to limit the effects that we had from March onwards. But, that's 2020 hindsight, and I guess, we'll know for next time. But I think one of the biggest challenges, one of the things that surprised me the most has been really the extent to which the government has taken measures to restrict its citizens' freedoms and liberties during this phase, because it's quite something. And I've got elderly relatives who were around during World War II, and they don't ever recall anything like this happening during wartime. And yet here we are with something which, to put it in context, is not going to kill many more people than flu does each year. I mean, I know everyone's totally paranoid about it now, but it's not necessarily, it's certainly not like the Spanish flu epidemic and things on that scale. It's more infectious than some, but less deadly than some. But to close down countries the way they have is unprecedented. Now, you may or may not agree with it. It's certainly not been done before. That's my point. And so when it becomes normal, and when there's no pushback pretty much from anyone that says, hold on a minute, have you got the right to do that? Isn't this a democracy? Isn't this isn't my freedom something that my grandfathers fought for in 2 world wars? Why am I giving this up so lightly and so easily and just complying with all these demands? Now, when it happens in China, of course you expect it. It's a totalitarian state. You know that's how they respond to these things. But when that happens in, Chipping Sodbury and Weybridge and all the rest of it, you think, ooh, I don't feel very comfortable with this. So for me, the one of the big things to come out of this is, what do we expect from our government, and what are we prepared to take from our government? And I think this is a debate that needs to be had a bit more loudly in our society, because I'm just shocked at how everyone's been so willing to comply. Everyone's almost been cowed in fear of this big bad boogeyman. I'm not even going to step out the house, or I'm going to wear a mask. I'm going to jump into the road if somebody comes anywhere near me. It's such an incredible over-the-top response given the risk. And it sets such a dangerous precedent, because once you give these powers to politicians, they don't give them back. They're now there forever, and every politician in the world has seen what's been possible, and that ain't going to go away or change anytime soon. So for me, that's at least as big a concern as the economic impact of COVID-19.
Oh, I get that, Graham. And as you say, a precedent has been set. And, if the COVID-19 virus gets a hold again in the UK, then we could be looking at further lockdowns. I do think the approach they're taking now to lock down just individual towns or cities that have a high infection rate is far more sensible than shutting down the entire country and economy. But, when this happened, there was so many conspiracy theories and different opinions of why this was happening. And I actually found it quite damaging to my own mental well-being to start going down those rabbit holes, because actually, we're not going to find an answer anytime soon. But are you implying, Graham, that there was something sinister behind what's happened, or are you, is it just a case that governments have to plan for the worst, and maybe they got some bad advice from some of their scientific advisors, but they did plan for the worst. They opened the Nightingale hospitals. They were never needed in the end. But are you thinking or implying that there's something sinister behind this?
No, I'm not, and I vaguely got amused at first by some of those theories, and then I just stopped listening to them because it was just ridiculous. I think one observation I would make is that we've had recently in recent years quite a few what I would call strongman leaders who have kind of risen into power, which would include Putin, Trump in that category, Bolsonaro, perhaps even Boris Johnson. They've had a truly awful pandemic. They're the ones that sort of, that's not going to affect me. I'm going to shake hands. It's only the flu. So, they've really been cut down to size. And, Boris has had it now. Bolsonaro's got it. So I think there's definitely been a kind of an arrogance that hasn't helped. No, for me, time will tell whether lockdown was the right strategy. It was certainly a very expensive strategy. I'm more surprised by people's reaction to it. Mm-hmm. In a way, I think this has gradually been building up since 9/11. There was an amazing kind of fear and fallout after 9/11, despite all the statistics saying, you're much more likely to be killed crossing the road than you are by a terrorist. People stopped traveling, and people start all these massive precautions at airports that, you practically have to strip naked every time you want to travel somewhere. So in some respects, when I see those measures, I think that the terrorists have already won. But I don't believe it's sinister, but I do believe it's serious and important. And I think it's a debate that has to be had, because there's a trade-off between risk and behavior. No one's saying we should ban smoking. No one's saying we should ban alcohol or ban driving, all the things that we know kill thousands of people every year. And yet we're prepared to take this level of constraint of our freedom over one particular way in which we might get ill or die. So, it's the proportionality of the response. It's the implications of the response going forward. And when you combine that with, what we're seeing, I mean, China's probably the best example. I'm deeply concerned by the recent actions in Hong Kong, which, really have now put effectively Chinese agents on the streets of Hong Kong above the law, able to do as they please, with some very wide-ranging laws that I read one report that said if an analyst criticized the performance of a Chinese state-owned company, they could potentially fall foul of this law about, insulting China, and be whisked off to the mainland to disappear forever into a Beijing prison. So, human rights and civil liberties have a bit of a bad name in the UK. They're regarded as sort of a liberal, lefty, tree-hugging-y stuff. It's so important. It really could happen to you or someone in your family. And when you start seeing the state assuming this power, I do come back to this analogy that we are frogs in the pan of water. And I think COVID-19 has turned the gas up on that cooker significantly. We need to be very careful about the long-term impact on our liberty.
Indeed, but what can we do about it, Graham? How can we make our voice heard against it? We've had this judicial review, but there's all sorts of other petitions going on and so on. If we do, share your views, what can we actually do about it? Because a lot of the frustrations for me personally during this difficult time was that I couldn't actually do anything about it. I just had to accept it. And acceptance was, unfortunately, the only way to really get some peace of mind during this difficult time.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, you've obviously got to look after your own sort of mental health, but I think we're not very good in this country at using the apparatus of democracy, which is just as simple as writing to your MP or doing an online survey or signing a petition. So, just letting people know that you're not happy and that you think that the government has perhaps exceeded its powers. What was fascinating is Simon Dolan's a very wealthy guy. He was prepared to fund that judicial review himself. And then I think it was his lawyer suggested, look, why don't you put it on the crowd justice page just to see if anyone else might want to join? And he got thousands and thousands of people who were putting comments in like, look, I can only afford a $5 or a $10, but I think what you're doing is so important. I want my voice to be heard with you. So that became a movement, and it was very active on Twitter and other social media. So it's important to recognize, just like the guys in Hong Kong, what do they do? Well, they're still protesting. And I salute them for that, because now they're at real risk. We are not very good at protesting. I know we've had all the stuff around Black Lives Matter recently, and I suspect, by the way, that that's got a much broader base of concern sitting behind it than the one issue that we saw in that tragic situation in America. I think we just need to become more activist in our politics. We need to use the mechanisms we can, whether that's just an email to your MP, whether it's eventually, hopefully, we can actually go and do something in person, and just say, look, we're not comfortable with the way in which you just took away our liberty like that, and we want to register our protest at that, and we want to see a much more nuanced approach next time, rather than taking this sledgehammer to a situation that's caused so much hardship. And one of the upshots of this, the hidden cost of this, will be the other health impacts that were effectively subjugated to COVID-19. So I spoke recently to an Asian community leader in Birmingham. He gets involved in situations where people have passed away in his community. He said, most of the deaths I've been dealing with recently were either untreated cancer patients who were pushed aside during COVID, or suicides from mental health issues as well. So, I don't know who's measuring those statistics, but there's going to be some real long-term costs to this. We need to make our politicians aware of that as well, that what we saw was a complete pivot towards only focusing the NHS on this one thing, and not, balancing that with all the long-term impact of defocusing on everything else. So I think they took far too blunderbuss an approach. They needed to be far more nuanced in their approach, and they need to learn from that next time, as well as obviously having all the right PPE for the frontline workers, etc. There's the very obvious things that weren't in place, but there's a lot more nuance as to how they need to react in the future. And we have to let them know we're not happy with it, because otherwise they'll assume everything's okay if we just remain compliant and silent.
No, absolutely. And, if we kind of go back to looking at this whole issue through, a landlord lens, I don't believe that things will ever go back to normal or how they used to be. I do believe that everything has changed irrevocably. And, for the property sector, it was, as you say, lockdown literally just put it on hold for the 3 months that we were in lockdown. It absolutely, put the property market into deep freeze. It's obviously starting to come back now. There have been measures today announced in the summer statement, but it's not going to be an easy ride going forwards. We as landlords should expect that we're going to have far more tenants in receipt of universal credit and LHA, far more rent arrears, less access to the court system. It was already a challenge to be a landlord before this, and now these extra challenges have been brought about by the whole fallout from COVID. I'm going to stick my neck out here, Graham, and I know that you've had doubts about buy-to-let for some considerable time, but I would say now that being a landlord is not for the faint-hearted or those that don't like too much stress or struggle to deal with problem solving, because going forwards landlords are going to have to be very skilled at all of those things, in my opinion.
Let's face it, landlords have already had 5 years of measures from supposed Tory governments that have shocked us all the way back to good old George Osborne. So they're already reeling from all that before COVID-19 even hit. And this is, to me, one of the great kind of injustices of all this, is that landlords provide a critical social service. People need somewhere to live. They can't all afford to buy, or they don't want to buy in that area for whatever reason, so they've got to have places to rent. And the market takes care of the rents being reasonable and fair. Competition takes care of, there are, one or two roads. The vast majority are, reasonable people who, do the right job by their tenants. But, I think the way landlords have been treated has been absolutely outrageous. But now, yes, as you say, I think it's becoming worse than ever. And I think the knock-on effect, again, if we follow the money, landlords are going to struggle. They might not pay their mortgages, and then the banks are going to struggle. So, I'm hearing of one or two people who are putting together kind of funds to go out and buy distressed portfolios. So there may be an exit, but probably at fire sale prices. Landlords are going to have to think very carefully about, can I reconfigure this property? Can I start marketing it differently to a different group of people? If I can't change the what, can I change the who? And it's really hard to say at the moment whether rents are going to go up or down as a result of all this, because maybe fewer people will buy because there are fewer mortgages available, so they'll be wanting to rent for longer. That would be positive for landlords. Maybe more people will, if prices do go down, there'll be bargains to be had, and they'll stop renting because they want to buy them. So it's going to be a real mishmash for the next 12 or 18 months, and landlords are just going to have to be on top of their numbers, and looking at the opportunities to either rebalance the portfolio, repurpose it in some way, reconfigure it in some way. But I think very few landlords will be unaffected by COVID-19 coming out the other end of this.
No, I totally agree. And that's something that we're going to dig deeper into tomorrow's instalment. But for now, I'll just say thank you once again to Graham for joining me today. And please join us tomorrow as our themed mini-series continues. We're calling it Surviving in the New Economy. And we'll be back tomorrow with more on this topic. But for now, we're saying goodbye, and I'll see you tomorrow, Graham.
Yeah, thanks a lot. See you then. Cheers.